Giving a warm town hall welcome to Emily Witt and Dr. Schwartz.
Thank you all for coming. This can be fun. For me, I hope it's fun for you, but I'm really jazzed for it. I've read Emily's book cover to cover, notated it, and we won't be able to cover all my questions, but just as an introduction to my own experience of the book, it's full of sex, but not particularly erotic, but it's fascinating throughout. I was hoping, but... and she writes beautifully. I mean, one of the great things about this book is that you'll enjoy the language in it. At least that was really a big pleasure for me. So just to sort of introduce the concept of it, and then I'm going to have a series of questions and let her do the preponderance of talking about her book. This is a book where she goes on both a psychological and physical journey, looking for things to find out about herself and the nature of relationships and intimacy. And on that journey, she goes to San Francisco, which seems to always be the incubator, not just of technology, but of various substances people exchange during sex. And have kind of sex as an extreme, not just sport, but rather innovations about sexuality that most of us can't even make up in our fantasy world, much less go out and try. So that's all there in the book. I hope I've whet your appetite for it, because it's really an interesting experience to read it, and it's beautifully done, if that's half the journey for me. So given that this is a book where Emily doesn't just tell you about her psychological journey, but she tells you how she tries all these things and what they mean to her and conclusions she has about love and intimacy and sex, I want to start out and say, why did you write this book? Because you could have had that journey and not written about it, or or shared it in less conspicuous ways. But this is a very specific kind of personal exposure, as well as absolutely detailed, extremely good description about what happens. So I want to start there.
Yeah, I mean, I came to it first as a writing project. I wanted to write something longer than a magazine article, and yeah, this is kind of boring, but I was looking for a subject that I could do at book length, and I didn't, if you read my book proposal in 2011, it wasn't this book. It was I didn't know what I was looking for exactly. I just knew that there'd been a demographic shift of people getting married much later, and not at all a technological shift of the internet and new ways to meet people and new ways to find communities, and a kind of social shift where I saw a proliferation of sexual identities and sexual, kind of new language around sexuality. But among my friends, I just saw a lot of anxiety about internet dating, internet pornography, why they weren't married yet, like their parents, what was going on with their lives. And it was also a personal question. And I read The Neighbor's Wife by Gay Talese, which is a cultural history of the sexual revolution that came out in 1981, which is the year I was born. And I felt that book I saw as this amazing, it had this ability to capture this national shift that had happened in the culture through individual stories. And so I thought I would try to do something like that. And then I started writing, or I started reporting. And it's funny because I wouldn't have done all this stuff if I wasn't writing about it. For me, journalism initially was the alibi. I thought I thought of myself as a very conventional person with conventional mainstream expectations. I thought I wanted to get married, or I just kind of assumed it was going to happen. And then as I went reporting and telling everybody I was a reporter, and being really adamant about that, it started to change my own ideas about my sexuality and my expectations, the stories I was telling myself about what to expect from adult life and what to expect from sexuality, and then I was encouraged by my editor to turn it more first person. She thought Gay Talise's omniscient new journalism voice was kind of dated, and so it became a first person book, but with this reported foundation.
Easy for her to say.
Yeah, exactly.
So just dig a little deeper right there. There's a quote from you. You said you went to San Francisco because you said, quote, "because my desires and my reality had diverged beyond the point of reconciliation." What did you mean by that?
I was sad. At this point, I had turned 30. I had just gotten dumped, which it's a boring story that happens to most of us at some point. But, I was really sad about it because I thought I had met the person that I wanted to be with. And so, everything I was reading about, well, basically, my desire was this kind of beautiful, perfect, messianic love that I was kind of waiting to arrive. And my reality was a kind of messy, anybody who's dated will know what it was like. It's just kind of mix of rejection and kind of baffling casual relationships that would end in sort of weird dishonesty or kind of ghosting, or I begin the book with me sitting in a waiting room because I had an STD scare. I just felt like my life, it wasn't what I wanted it to be. And so I was interested in trying to find happiness with my sexual freedom, which I'd never valued. I never had heard any happy ending that ended with somebody having all the possibilities in the world available to them. And so that was kind of the question I set out to answer was, okay, I think of myself as this kind of person that doesn't want to watch porn and doesn't want to have casual sex on the internet and doesn't want to do all this stuff that's available to me. What if I talk to people that feel differently? And let myself consider their definition of happiness, and maybe I can find something that's more aligned with my present and my reality than this true love thing.
Well, it does strike me a little bit about someone who wants to learn how to swim, so they do one of these oceanic, marathons, and see how that feels. So let's go a little bit into the stuff, and then I want to ask you about some of your conclusions. So this isn't the first chapter, but it's one that catches your attention. And am I saying this correctly? Oming?
Yeah.
Okay. So for those of you who haven't done this, this is about going to kind of a charismatic leaders class where the theory and practice is that women should have sexual excitement and climactic release without having to do anything in return. And a woman takes the class, which repeats in many ways. I'm going to leave more to this, but masturbates a woman to climax, showing how it's done. And then if you want to, they can either use you as the model to show you how you have a climax, you being female. And there's chances for the same practice done between people who meet each other there or are part of this group. And eventually you also engage in this. So tell us about that.
Yeah, sure. So the practice is called orgasmic meditation, or that's how I think it comes out of tantric practices, but it's been kind of codified and franchised by this group called One Taste. And Yeah, it's 15 minutes. A woman takes off her pants, is stroked by her partner. It's actually, the emphasis is not supposed to be on climax. It's just supposed to be a kind of meditative experience where you're allowing yourself to, as in meditation, when you're focused on the breath, you're just kind of focused on feeling whatever comes up in your body and perhaps naming it or describing it to the person that's stroking you. And it's not supposed to be foreplay. It's supposed to be something that can happen between friends. There's
Instead of golf.
Yeah, exactly. No, they literally say it over and over. They're like, oming can be like asking a friend to have a cup of tea, and it's like, no, it's not going to be like that. But okay. But yeah, and then, and there's especially not supposed to be expectation reciprocation, and so the idea is for women, sexuality is so tied up in romance and in stories of dating and worries about who's going to pay for dinner and wanting to please your partner, and even no matter how liberated of a woman you think you are, that there's still these kind of, sex becomes this like servicing contract for each other. And the idea about this is like, because they've created this contained space that you can think about your desire and practice naming it, and in this kind of way that you're not trying to please somebody. But of course, maybe you still are. But yeah, so what was the question again? I'm sorry.
Oh, well, my big question I haven't asked yet on this is, well, what was it like? I mean, you say you went back several times, got owned, and so I'm curious what that was like for you. I mean, I don't think you really say in the book.
So it was extremely uncomfortable for me. And again, journalism was the alibi, and they kept saying, well, you can't understand this or really write about it well unless you try it, which is kind of a classic human potential movement assertion. And I was uncomfortable because there was also all of this language, kind of jargon, and it came out, the culture that it was in was really this like California New Age human potential landmark forum stuff. So there would be lots of kind of calling somebody out. They'd have these group sessions and they would make people do things that made them really uncomfortable. You'd have to stand in front of somebody and they would describe all the flaws in your physical appearance, which it was just excruciating and difficult. So I was doing this and really hating these people.
I could tell, you said you avoided them on the street. I thought, okay.
I just was like, and I mean, I live in New York. I'm sarcastic. I like to go to bars. I'm try to be healthy, but I like to have fun. And there was this emphasis on I don't know. But that said, it was, I went there, I did it, and I kind of just kept thinking about stuff that I'd learned there, I'm really glad that I did it. And it makes me uncomfortable to say that because I don't want to, they're very proselytizing group of people, but I don't know, for me, it was a worthwhile experience. The main thing I took away from it was that I had always experienced flirtation, and I don't know, I'd experienced sexual feelings with panic and anxiety, and part of my discomfort with this group of people was that manifesting again. And they named that, or the founder, this woman, Nicole Didion, she kind of called that out for me. And I realized it was true. And I realized that the other thing is that, I'd always thought of sexual experimentation as sort of Sex in the City. You just like go out and you try a bunch of stuff, but actually it can be very internal. It can be a thought experiment. It can be, looking at something on the internet that you wouldn't normally look at. You can open your mind to certain things in really small, safe, very personal, solitary ways. And that's kind of what I learned from them is that I could let myself open up to some things without losing myself and without becoming, I don't know, damaged or something, which I think I'd been scared of.
Well, I mean, it was truly brave. I mean, there's one thing there, and I'll go on to, because this is not all boys and girls. There's more adventures. But that you did this in a public setting as well, and did achieve an orgasm. I kind of think that's, kind of an Olympic level achievement, really. I mean,
I don't know. I mean, what I say in the book is that I don't know. You can kind of will an orgasm sometimes. I don't.
Yeah, I think you would have to sort of do that. I mean, I thought that was intriguing.
It wasn't that it was the best orgasm or that it was a beautiful, sexual experience. It was still uncomfortable for me. Yeah.
Well, that didn't strike me as uncomfortable as the next adventure. And that's a group called Public Disgrace. And that's all about having a woman who's into a certain kind of masochistic sexual experience from which she comes out totally ecstatic. I think you said that Penny, after having been told that she's a worthless cunt and other kinds of things like that, and being screwed in every possible way you can think of, and really being treated badly from a feminist point of view, but from her sexuality, she loved it, and the audience sort of participates as invited in, and you're part of the audience. And I wonder, how did you experience it? Did you? I mean, I read it, and yet I still wasn't clear exactly whether this was erotic to watch, whether it was, and let's not talk PC. I mean, like, what was, I mean, this is about anti-PC. This is about people's desires and acting them, whatever they happen to be. But the fact is, she's treated as a thing, an object, and she loves it, and she enjoys it, I guess. But you're watching it, and you go. That's not just a one-time experience. Although I remember you saying that it was on YouTube or something public later, and you couldn't watch it then.
Well, it's porn. These are professionals. Yeah. So this is a kink.com series called Public Disgrace, and the fantasy of the porn is a woman being humiliated and groped in public. The shoots are participatory in the sense that there's an audience there to watch the porn performers having sex with each other, and you're supposed to heckle and call, in this case, the woman names and really derogatory names like worthless cunt, and the performer signs a rider that says she's okay with slapping or groping or everything she's okay with, and it's just like the audience is supposed to wash their hands and then they can kind of do what they want. But
I thought that was a strange honor system, like,
well,
did you wash them really well?
There's a director of the shoot, this woman, Princess Donna, who I spent some time with, and she's there watching to make sure things don't go too far, and of course the performer has a safe word. And so I went into this, this is not how I want the world to look, but I was interested in Princess Donna, who's this dominatrix porn performer, multi-talented person who is very well versed, and she majored in gender studies at NYU. So a feminist, why a feminist would make this kind of pornography that looks so counter to a free and equal world. And I heard a lot of things while I was at Kink. One is that, why it was attractive to the performers. Your whole life you're told as a woman, you're taught to be scared. You're taught to be scared about walking home at night, about going to a bar and getting too drunk and having something happen to you. You're taught to live in a state of vigilance and fear. And so here was a situation where they could enact the worst thing, kind of, but they had control within it, and they got to experience, I don't know, the women that liked this, they experienced it as a form of power and freedom, to have it happen, but you're in control and there's somebody watching out for you, and it's a fantasy. So that was compelling to me. And then, thinking of it as pornography, and that, there were people out in the world that this is what they watch, and it makes them happy or turns them on. That also was kind of upsetting to me. But then when I thought about, the power of it comes from the power of its taboo. And, I don't think that this kind of porn means that we, are going to live in a world where this is acceptable, at the bar, or whatever. I
Right.
think part of its power and part of the reason that it exists now is because we as a society value autonomy and equality, and all of these things that this pornography is transgressing. Maybe that's kind of Pollyanna-ish of me, but in general with the book, like, all the objections to everything I was doing were really obvious, and I wanted to give space and thought to an optimistic view of what something might represent, and so I err on the side of optimism throughout the book, I hope.
Well, as long as we're on fantasy, and pornography is largely fantasy, what I found really interesting is that you didn't like pornography when you began, but you wanted to, or did, in fact, teach yourself to respond to certain kinds of pornography so that it did turn you on. And so I sort of wonder a little bit about that journey, and what themes became arousing to you.
Well, it was kind of, in my 20s when I'd find out, I'd catch a boyfriend's laptop open on some porn, and I would just feel anger and disgust and anxiety and feel kind of upset about it. I don't know. And I grew up in a liberal household where, we didn't talk about it, but I think that it was kind of like the objection to porn was never sin or Christian morality. It was feminist morality, that this stuff feels wrong because it objectifies women, and it's somehow bad for women for all the reasons that were articulated by many feminists in the 1980s. And so again, as a thought experiment, what if I let myself watch it? And what if I let myself, just like watch it, and also, again, once I'd kind of realized I was kind of hiding to myself when I would be turned on by something. So like be as honest as possible about how this was going to make me feel, or how it was making me feel. And yeah, lo and behold, it turned me on. And I believed all these things that I'd read too, that women like romance stories and men like visual stories. And honestly, I do think that has something to do with how we're socialized. And I think, most humans, when presented with images of people having sex, are going to have some feelings. I don't know.
I hope so.
Yeah. And then as far as what I like, it's funny because I know that I don't like most of the porn that's made for women that tries to be kind of clean, like the interiors are white or something. And
I think you said it was like a little room with drapes blowing in the wind.
Well, I was kind of making a joke there because a lot of times, I talk in the book about this idea of the clean, well-lighted place, which was the slogan for Good Vibrations, the feminist sex shop, and also the title of an Ernest Hemingway short story. But it came up over and over and over in reporting this book in the context of female sexuality. Whatever it was, internet dating, the one-taste people, the feminist pornographers, they would be like, well, we're just trying to create like a clean, well-lighted space, the clean, well-lighted version of porn and the clean, well-lighted version of internet dating. And what that usually meant was a kind of, they're going to take the sex out of it and make it be kind of like romantic, or kind of turn it clinical and kind of, take male sexual fantasy out of it somehow, but that also usually meant all literal depictions of sex. And so I knew that this like feminist sex like videos, they felt sort of euphemistic. There's also the genre of education porn, so you're like learning how to have anal sex, but instead of really watching porn. And it felt dishonest. I guess I was always looking for the most honest expression of something. So yeah, I mean, a lot of what is on Pornhub is kind of disappointing and boring to me, but at the same time, it works.
Well, when you say, I admired throughout the book your real searching to find like what were you really thinking, what were you really feeling. And there's a little bit of research, to be boring, about that where they do this thing with a plethysmograph, which basically feels changes in terms of blood, either if it's on a penis, whether it engorges with blood, or in a vagina, whether it, all the nerves are tingling and engorges with blood. And men were very, very much aware of when that was happening to them, and women were almost totally unaware of when that was happening to them and were saying they weren't turned on, and their body was saying, oh, yes, I am. So, it is an interesting process that we go through culturally. Mention your little experience with Chatterbait. That was one was news to me, too.
Yeah, Chatterbait is a live webcam site. That I wrote about, it was actually an assignment for an online magazine called Matter. And when I got the assignment, I kind of just needed the money, and I was like, oh, I'm not going to need this for the book because it's just, I thought it was just a classic peep show dynamic of a person, usually a woman or a gay man, performing for an audience of voyeurs. And when I went on the landing page, there's tons of websites like this, but the reason that Chatterbait was interesting, even though it's not the biggest or most well-known or anything, is it's like totally free, so you don't need to sign up or anything. You can just watch people, and you can also broadcast without having to do very much. So I went on there thinking like, oh, I gotta find a story here. There isn't one. How do I do this? And then it turned out to be really fascinating. I think, basically I interviewed a bunch of women and a couple gay guys. And the women, especially, many of them told me that this was a space where they felt like they could experiment with what one woman called mass intimacy. So the experience of sort of being, which as a woman you can't, it's really hard to engineer this kind of like mass, casual, it's hard to get that kind of sexual experience without risking a lot. And yet, so here online, some of the women I talked to felt like they were getting this kind of experience and learning about their desires and their fetishes and things they could do, they didn't know they could do, all kinds of things. And enabled by this technology and the fact that they could block people, they could turn it off, they could feel kind of anonymous on it. And because, you know, most women can't go to a park at night and cruise, but here was this this place where something like that was happening a little bit.
In the interest of time, you know, all of these things I could spend a lot of time talking about because they're all fascinating to me. You had a chapter on polyamory, and polyamory is the ability to have sex and to love more than one person, and it distinguishes itself from recreational non-monogamy by there's an attachment. This is somewhat deeper, at least for some part of that unit. And we hear about the Ravenheart Zells, who have a long-term relationship that becomes somewhat aggressively polyamorous, and they do in fact end up getting married. They have a triangle with a man who ultimately edges out of the relationship. But you said at one point, which is actually something that I kind of thought, which was your quote was, sometimes I just think of this as a slower way of breaking up with someone, which I think my own reading of polyamory is somewhat more common than the Ravenheart Zell's ability to, you know, create, you know, at least a lifetime relationship based on this principle. So I'm curious about what you think about polyamory, how you think why jealousy does or does not operate in the usual way there, and if this is an alternative model of relationship, or, you know, about as common as oming.
I think it's much more common than oming, and it's going to be more common. I mean, I feel like the word has probably, if you n-grammed it on Google, there would be a skyrocketing popularity of it. I just feel like it's everywhere on Tinder and stuff right now. But yeah, this part of the book, I spend time with three, at the time they were really young, kind of just out of college, people in San Francisco who worked at Google, and they kind of went into relationships with each other with the expectation of being open there from the beginning. And yeah, I don't know. So jealousy is one of the biggest challenges if you undertake this kind of lifestyle. And you know, I think it's kind of like if you're married, if you're in a monogamous marriage, the temptation is or kind of, wandering eye or something is the feeling you're trying to suppress. And if you're in a polyamorous arrangement, maybe jealousy is the emotion that you know you're going to feel to varying degrees from time to time. And you acknowledge it, it's there, you're not trying to pretend it's not there, but it's like the ignoble emotion that you're trying to you don't want to rule your life. So I see it as kind of, it's just a different way of dealing with an emotion. As for, for me personally, polyamory, specifically having more than one partner that was a real partner and not just somebody you had sex with once in a while or something, that would be very difficult for me. But I really admire people that pull that off, and I do think it's possible. That group, these three people that I wrote about, I had dinner with two of them last week, and they're married now legally, but they're still, this is them. They're not gonna, it's not something that's gonna stop or start. It's just them.
I love the wedding ceremony that you put in there, where the person who's conducting the ceremony says, "You may now kiss the bride and other people."
Yeah.
Which I have to say, I've been in a lot of ceremonies, but that was new. And to me, it's thinking. I've thought a lot about this because I'm as a college professor, I meet a lot of young people who are trying this out, And, you know, I have my own feelings about the basic territoriality of us as a species. So I am curious to see how these experiments go and if it does become a parallel way of being. Which takes me to two more questions, and then we'll open it up for discussions. And I'll wait. One question that I noticed in this passage of yours is that at Burning Man, where you talk about community, and at a lot of places, particularly with Google people who you hung out with but seem to have some negative thoughts about, hyperbolic optimism was one description, entitlement, things like that. But so much of this happens with drugs. I mean, the drugs are in almost all, not in every chapter, but they're ubiquitous. And they're not the sort of low rent drugs. You know, they're things you put behind your tongue and then the world is in purple. And, or I have to admit that I'm not knowledgeable about them, but they were mind enhancing, perspective changing types of drugs. And so I'd like to feel if you think this is a necessary part of life and emotion expansion that more of us should do, or, you know, what's the place of it in this universe?
Yeah, I mean, that was something that was an unexpected kind of side effect of writing the book, is a realization of the relationship of psychoactive substances and sexuality. I mean, obviously, you know, when you go out on a date, unless you're sober, you usually go have a drink with somebody because it relaxes you, makes you more open. You know, and for so many of the people that I interviewed in the book, a more intense psychoactive experience like LSD or mushrooms or MDMA, that's not psychedelic, but, you know, those drugs helped because they were trying to figure out these complicated relationship arrangements. They would sometimes take MDMA or LSD so that they could see what happened, you know, see if they were able to speak about things in a more honest way than they felt otherwise. And then, you know, there's also the fact that certain drugs can enhance sex and make it more fun or make it more intense. You know, I think that's always been there. We're, you know, kind of crawling our way out of an intellectual paradigm about drugs that has been in place for the past 50 years or so that, you know, we're sort of realizing is really arbitrary. You know, what's medical, what's recreational, what's medicine, yeah, what's you know, what's actually dangerous and what just you know, has a really intense effect on you. So it's kind of, I think all of those, you know, I'm thinking a little bit that it might be my next book actually because it's so related to this one. And yeah, I don't think it's good or bad. I think it's humans use psychoactive substances, whether it's taking a Xanax before you get on an airplane or it's having a drink before a date or an antidepressant or cocaine to stay up all night. It's just kind of, it's always going to be a part of it, and especially with something as intense and as vulnerable as sex, people use psychoactive substances in any imaginable way to get themselves to a place where they feel more comfortable or they can have difficult conversations or have a more intense experience.
You know, it's a longer conversation. I do want to see the book on that because, you know, me, it's like, it's kind of good enough, you know. But, okay. So the last thing I want to talk about is what I think is a very serious and thoughtful theme that runs through the book because it runs through you. And that is the nature of people's attachment and the way people live in today's world and in today's emotional choices and sexual choices. And basically, it seems to me in the last chapter, but you sort of foresee it in your introduction, that for many people, the picket fence picture is just either not working or not going to happen. You know, the idea that marriage will be the core and center of one's life, and you will have a child there, and you will find your one and only, or at least maybe even a series of one and onlys, but that will happen in one's life, you know, in a marital committed framework, and that's how you will have children, and that's how sex should be. And at the end, it seems to me what you're saying is that that's just not going to happen for everyone. It may not happen for you. And so it seemed to me you wanted to build a kind of wall between what you do for companionship, for reproduction, for almost like, in some ways I thought sort of like an arranged marriage type of thing where that love wasn't the necessary element, but continuity and co-parenting or co-living in the world would be, you know, an anchor of its own, and then sexuality would be in a whole different, maybe even parallel world, where this would be a world that was freer in some of the ways that you had experienced it during this journey. There was a quote of yours that I thought, to make sure I got it in your words, as you wrote it. It said, it's 2004. Some people would remain committed to the institution of marriage, but I hope that married partnership would cease to be seen as a totalizing endpoint and instead become something more modest, perhaps an institutional basis for shared endeavors, or such as raising children or making art. Open marriage had already lost its stigma. Practice would make us better at the emotional management of multiple concurrent relationships. We would have more overt experience in free love, more evidence to work with. Failed marriage would no longer be interpreted as personal failure. So could you expand on that? Because that seems to be a conclusion you reached here, and I also wonder if it's a conclusion you continue to feel.
Yeah, I'm a little worried because that's the galley.
Uh-oh.
I maybe rewrote that a little bit, but the idea is the same. I mean, you know, a lot of people have been reading the book and they're like, oh, it's not futuristic at all. But to me, you know, that's the futuristic science fiction part is a world where we have a range of different kinds of families and different kinds of relationships. And we've already moved away from this ontological monoculture that maybe used to reign, at least publicly. And I think it's just going to go farther. And, you know, you look at statistics, I think something like more than 40% of births in the U.S. are to unwed parents, and in certain communities that percentage is much higher. And, you know, it's kind of like our institutions, our government. I mean, I don't want to go into our government right now, but these are...
It's okay. This is Seattle. We can all mourn together.
I don't know, but just... I mean, these changes we've been treating as a society like there's some kind of accident, or they're compelled by economic inequality and inequality, or it's always treated like some kind of thing that's happening but not with intention. And I think there's a lot to, you know, it'd be better if we start naming these different kinds of, or trying to name them, coming up with a taxonomy, with legal structures, with tax structures, you know, that we treat this as not, you know, the single parent not as an anomaly. I mean, that's the most obvious one, but co-parenting, I don't know, even possible communal relationships. I know that has a dicey history, but I'm just interested in all of that. I think it's just that's the direction this society seems to be moving in demographically, and why not start trying to really, in the way that polyamory now is a word that didn't exist before 1992, basically, why not name some of these alternative family models and sexual structures that are happening?
But as a child of the late 60s and 70s, I think it's like sort of back to the future. I lived in a commune for a while, and I certainly, experimented with sexuality as a free and open experience, and most things devolved to, if you cared for somebody, they devolved to territoriality, jealousy, misunderstandings, a desire for something more than, if it was a great orgasm, you wanted more of them and you didn't particularly want to share them. Do you think people have evolved so that these experiments of the 60s and 70s, which most people said, well, okay, that didn't work so well, and I think the ones that did work for all went to San Francisco, as far as I can tell. I'm just curious about our capacity for that, or why we would have a greater capacity or better luck at it now than we did then.
Yeah, that was the idea that I was raised with, was that it went too far in the 60s and 70s, and we didn't need so much freedom and so much enlightenment. I guess, there's a phrase in San Francisco that I say is kind of a joke in the book, but it's called responsible hedonism. And, things have changed. We have greater understanding of sexual health. We have different gender relations now, I think, than back then. And I make the analogy in the book is with drugs, is, similarly, there was this kind of psychedelic explosion and then a total shutting down of things that were, being used for psychiatric research in addition to being taken to watch a Grateful Dead show. And, maybe there's a way we can open that door up a little bit cautiously, and let ourselves conduct some experiments in thinking, and that's happening already. I feel like with sex also, okay, yeah, it went too far. You don't want to have the Manson family again, or what, I don't know. What's the worst cult that happened?
That'll do.
Yeah.
Right?
But maybe there is a way to just mindfully and cautiously try some of these things and know that some of these experiments are going to fail, but maybe we can try some again at least.
Well, it's a brave and thoughtful and beautifully written book, and thank you for being so open and honest in the book and here. And I'm sure people have some questions they would like to address to you, so why don't we open it up for that?
For any questions, please line up. If you have a question, please line up at one of the microphones. Please keep your question short, to the point, and enjoy.
You can ask a question that your friend would like answered.
Hi. I'm about the same age as you, and it sounds like this book kind of falls into this genre of discussions of sexuality in the 21st century that are basically talking about freedom and opportunity and perhaps even chaos. But I'm wondering if you address there's a significant minority of people. There's a study that estimates 5% of men and 2% of women who remain virgins, much as I hate the word, well into adulthood. And I have articles on 40 and 60-year-old virgins in here. And or people who reach adulthood, well into mature adulthood, and have never had romantic relationships. If people choose not to have sex or relationships, or they don't want them, then that's fine. But as far as people who actually do want them but can't get them, and there's studies that find that this phenomenon is associated with a lot of negative emotions, depression, isolation, ostracism. Is there any accounting for this? Is there anything going on to try and address it, to try and help this minority of people?
That's a really good question about something I don't know anything about, unfortunately. I mean, you know, I can imagine that the internet has offered some possibilities of at least mediated sexual interaction, but maybe that's not satisfying. I know that I think there's a kind of sex work that's kind of almost, that kind of work.
Well, it costs money and it's not legal.
Yeah.
They let it happen in California.
If you can get there.
What? Yeah, it's true. Well, you could hitchhike. But no, I mean, there are sex surrogates in the Bay Area, and the police leave them alone. They work with licenses. They've created a union, of course. And I'm not being facetious in the general sense that I think there is a role for that. That, you know, because it gets rolled into prostitution, et cetera, which has been here since recorded time, and that too seems to take the police some focus, though again, there are places in the country like San Francisco where they just don't want to get embroiled in that. The fact is that, to my sense, there's always going to be a continuum of everything. And one continuum will be of people who either want to be abstinent or find themselves abstinent, or, you know, don't have the social skills or have the opposite of social skills that get in between them in a romantic or sexual relationship. And, you know, that's a difficult population. There's no easy answer.
All right, I guess I just want to urge you to try to think about us in that context and just empathize with what that might feel like, because I can tell you it's pretty horrible.
Thank you. I haven't thought about that before.
Hi. Hello.
Hey.
Oh, hi there.
Hey there, turn around, Pepper.
Sorry about that.
No problem. I read the book and I really enjoyed it, and I was surprised because the one and the most accessible part and probably the greatest insights you had into sexuality were in the first chapter on online dating, yet you somehow did not cover that at all. I realize it's not as titillating as talking about manipulations and orgasms, but that was probably the greatest insights you had, and the most accessible aspect of the book that many people could relate to was the online dating part. Any reason you didn't cover that?
Just now in the conversation?
Yeah, in today's conversation.
Well, from my point of view, I did want to go to the things that were less likely to have ever been talked about before, which was just about everything else. And the internet dating, to me, in that part, was really about her. I think it's kind of a sad part of the book where she doesn't find love or acceptance, or it seems a kind of sad passage about internet dating, and I think it drives her towards looking elsewhere for a different style of life. That was my interpretation of it.
Yeah, I mean, maybe part of the reason I didn't give it, for me, I feel almost like my internet dating experience is kind of boring to a lot of people that internet date, because it never really worked out for me, and I don't know, it didn't go as deep as some people, and so in some ways I wasn't sure I had the right to write about it. And, you know, for me, I was kind of more interested in the presentation of these digital platforms and the kind of stories that people needed to have, you know, like for Tinder. When I started, I got an assignment to write about Tinder for GQ, and it was still new in 2013. And everybody I talked to asked me what it was supposed to be for. And I was there to ask them what it was supposed to be for. You know, and everybody had this expectation of it being about casual sex, or, you know, kind of instant sex. But then I talked to tons of people that said they would never use it that way. And, you know, it was interesting to me. What I realized is that for straight women, especially, for some reason, in order to get them to participate in internet dating platforms, sex needs to be a clean, well-lighted place. It needs to be kind of hidden, so that's kind of became the insight of that chapter. But me trying every app and ultimately I didn't have that much to offer there. Maybe.
Interesting. I thought that was the most interesting chapter.
I'll read it again.
Hi.
Hi.
I haven't read the book yet. I'm excited to, but I was wondering, for those who are looking to open their minds and kind of explore the same way you did, what would be your top 3 tips for some? Or 5.
Top 3. I don't know. I watching porn was, I would say watch porn just to understand, to get in the practice of naming your desires and turning them into search terms, and also to kind of, if it's something that makes you anxious, to sort of demystify it. Also, I think, you don't even have to like it. You don't even have to masturbate to it or whatever, but it kind of gave me at least a sense of the very wide range of sexual interests and practices that exist, and that I found something a little bit comforting in that. I don't know. I think that's underrated for women, at least. And what else? I guess part of the process of this book that made me more confident, it's hard to name like 1 or 2 things, but really just examining my own sense of what good and bad sex was and where that came from and what constituted sexy. And, when I started the book and I went on an internet date with somebody and they were perfect and had gone to Harvard and were really accomplished, and yet I'd be like, what is wrong with me? I don't like this person. But really, I didn't want to have sex with them, and I couldn't even admit that to myself. So the process of kind of just naming when you do want to have sex with somebody, like, oh, I want to have sex with that person, or when you don't, I think it's just to do it in your head. You don't have to tell anybody. But that for me was that was nice. That was an exercise that. I felt like I became a more authentic person that way.
I thought one thing that you said that was really interesting in that respect was that you felt better about your body after you had watched a bunch of porn.
Yeah, there's everything in porn. And it was also just hanging around all these naked people. And just their ease with which they went in and out of it, and just kind of their lack of self-consciousness, their openness to just talking about everything. I just realized, like, what Vogue tells you is sexy and beautiful. It's just, and most people, if you look at what you're attracted to, it's like, oh yeah, it's not the beautiful person necessarily. It's not, once you use your own kind of gauge of attraction to kind of realize, oh, it's much more open and less limited than I thought it was. Yeah.
I think one of the interesting things that I, having studied porn a little bit, but also reading your book, was that fantasy is much wilder than we let on that it is, and that you bring that out in the book. I have to say the one about the giant pandas raping this woman to her satisfaction was one I couldn't quite get into personally, but that somebody made that movie and other persons, were looking for giant panda sex, just opens up the world, really.
I'll just say that was for a series that Kink does called Bound Gangbangs, and it was people subscribed to it because that's their specific thing. And I looked at the comments and they were so mad. They didn't want pandas. Yeah.
I feel better about that now. Okay.
They were like, this week sucks.
No. Not real pandas, right?
I don't want to know.
Oh, panda outfits.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's it's really hard to get
Cosplay
pandas to
pandas, yeah.
do that. Okay.
Touche, really.
I experienced my own freedom recently after a divorce and a dissolution of a 25-year marriage, and I didn't like the dating scene at all. It seemed very fake and phony, and what I found was that I really didn't know anything about sex because my sex had always been about a man's cycle and of sex, and so I finally read the Height Report, which is from the 70s, and it was just 50 questions about women and their answers to it. And I thought, well, I'm in there. I'm normal. I'd asked my OBGYN doctor, was everything working down there? Because I didn't think it maybe was. And he just said, oh, they always say that. But then he didn't explain anything to me. And we don't have any sexual education in America. So did you come to any realization about your sexuality being maybe not mainstream, or that women are different than men when it comes to what arouses them? The whole cycle, I found out, was different. But I was really shocked that in my 50s I would realize and come to the awareness that I really didn't know anything about sex.
Yeah, I think I had a similar. I mean, I had good sex ed in the sense that I had really nice hippie teachers that talked more than just about the medical side of things and discussed pleasure and all of that. But it's kind of the only thing for women that I think is different for men, or I mean, whatever, if you can make these generalities, is, it's not intuitive, it's not easy to figure out. You have to put a little work into it and study. And, most people find that very beneficial when they do. But that also means there's only so much that you can do by yourself. And so that's why an organization like One Taste or the kind of work that Betty Dodson did in the 70s, that stuff is really, the nice thing about One Taste is they've created a space where you can try things with a partner, but it's not sex and it's not dating. And so that, that I think, and maybe the live webcams in its own way is another version of that. It's like a way that people can interact with each other outside of romance, outside of actual intercourse, which maybe feels risky or you're not ready for, or you can just, go on Craigslist and look for somebody.
Well, I appreciate that question, because one of the things that occurs to me is that, kids get, somewhere around 5th grade, they get education about sperm and egg chases, and a lot of good that does. But they do get some anatomy and things like that, and then sometimes if they're in progressive school districts, they'll get something better like you got. But then it stops. And I teach courses on human sexuality, and there's one in psych as well. But they're not, how-tos. And there's this assumption that sex is natural and you will figure out how to. But as you describe a lot in your book, so much of this is in our brains. And so you have to figure out your brain as well as your body and see how the two want to get along together, and if they want to go explore together. And that kind of permission and that kind of education is not around.
Hello. I was wondering, in the polyamorous couples that you were interviewing and reporting on, if you could go into how they were managing the time between themselves and, just like the number of couples you interviewed and some of the things you saw, if they had like contracts or, like a set of rules in place or, just that sort of thing.
Yeah, basically I didn't talk to that many people. It's just mostly I focus on one couple that's, a primary couple, and then a third person who was the woman's kind of secondary partner and the man's best friend. And the third guy also had feelings for the man those weren't reciprocated. And so they, now they're married, so that's a kind of contract. But other than that, they don't, I think as they became more comfortable and more experienced with the polyamory, the rules fell away. So in the beginning, I'm sure some of these rules are still in place. The primary couple, one rule was if the other person called and said, you have to come home right now, that would happen. But that was kind of like a red phone or something that was never actually used. It was like the nuclear option that was there as a statement of commitment, but more of a mental one. And what else? They had this particular couple full disclosure. So that didn't mean that you had to tell the person before you had sex outside the relationship, but that at some point you would say, they erred on the side of spontaneity. They're computer people, so they say they were in fail open mode, which apparently is a term borrowed from internet security. And then what else? But yeah, I mean, they also, especially the woman in that relationship, she had fallen in love. Since I met her, she's really fallen in love, I think twice, had real love relationships, once with a woman and once with a man. And, they also discussed what would happen if the relationship kind of hit a crisis where one person like really, really fell in love. And I think the conclusion they came to is they can anticipate that, but they can't plan for that. And, I think where they're at right now is they're interested in defining things in terms of 5-year commitment, but if they have a kid, they want an 18-year commitment. Yeah, but they're married.
Any other questions? Yeah.
I think it's really shocking and amazing what the internet and computers have done for sex and the dating scene. And since this is called future sex, what's it going to look like in 5 years, in 10 years? What is that going to do to us? Where else can it possibly go?
Well, I think, there's just going to be a proliferation of relationship forms. There's going to be more names. I think, there's going to be, as gender continues, the kind of gender binary crumbles, there's going to be new forms of sexual identification that are going to follow that. I think there's going to be new ideas about family. That's the kind of like soft science fiction. The hard sci-fi is maybe like, I don't know. I'm actually writing a story on virtual reality porn right now. And the amazing thing about it is how right now it's just regular porn, but the people are just like giant, like looming over you. And because most of it's from male POV, it's like a really weird experience for me as a woman. But, there will be, the person in my book that describes herself as internet sexual, I think that's going to become more of maybe a mainstream identification, which for some people is going to be really sad. But, we're already seeing people that are just more comfortable with mediated digital relationships than IRL ones. So maybe more in that.
Well, maybe that answers the question of the first person. There can be a democratization of sexual experience that is beginning now, but may become more generic and more widespread. Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much for your book and for your sharing yourself with everybody here tonight. And it was great. And thank you all for coming.
Thanks.